Today I rise to talk about the economy, what's going on out there in terms of jobs and wage growth. It's a positive story. I've seen it firsthand back home in Ohio. Every weekend we go back and I meet with small business owners. They tell me the same thing, which is things are good. Their biggest concern is finding workers. They're growing, expanding, and you see this in the national numbers as well. These small businesses tell me it's primarily because of the tax reform and tax cuts legislation, and then second, because of the regulatory environment. It's easier for them to be able to create more jobs. I want to start by talking about the tax reform. Remember, before this legislation was passed, going back really for several years, our economy had been relatively weak. We'd seen economic growth of between 1.5% and 2.5%. And a lot of people were saying, 2% growth is kind of the new normal. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office, which is the nonpartisan group up here that tells us what our growth numbers are likely to look like and then tells us what they actually are, the Congressional Budget Office said last year that they believed economic growth this year, calendar year 2018, would be 2%. Pretty discouraging, really. With 2% growth, you're not going to see the kind of growth in wages we all want to see. You're not going to see the job expansion we all want. That 2% growth was before the tax legislation was passed. They also predicted that employment would increase by an average of 107,000 jobs per month. Again, not bad, but not something to write home about. Now our economy's up and going, and it's moving toward its full potential. Shortly after tax reform passed, CBO changed its estimate. They said, okay, with tax reform, this is our new estimate. We're going to say that the growth is going to be, instead of 2% this year, it's going to be 3.1%. That's over a 50% increase in growth. That's incredible. They were pretty optimistic about what would happen. And they said that was attributable to tax reform. That was a big part of this upward revision, as they called it. They also changed their projection on monthly unemployment. They said instead of 107,000 jobs, we're likely to see 210,000 jobs per month. Well, what's happened? It turns out the Congressional Budget Office, despite their optimistic projection, were wrong. We've seen numbers even better than their optimistic projections. Economic growth for the second quarter of 2018 was 4.2%, and a record 876,000 new businesses were created. The Federal Reserve now estimates that growth in this quarter we're in is likely to be 4.1%. Wow. We'll see what the final numbers are. But if it's anywhere close to that, that is extraordinary. So we've gone from 2% to 3% to 4%. And with 4.2%, 4.1% growth, what else is happening? Unemployment is going down. Unemployment rate 3.7% last month. That's the lowest it's been since December 1969. So it's a big deal. The pro-growth policies that some of us have been promoting here on this side of the aisle, including the tax reform and regulatory relief, have made a difference. Small business optimism is at an all-time high, according to the National Federation of Independent Businesses, NFIB. And most important to me, wages are finally going up. Because the last 10 years, it isn't just that the economy has been relatively flat, it's that wages have not increased. In fact, when you take inflation into account, wages have been flat or even declining on average. And that's why a lot of people feel the squeeze, the middle-class squeeze, higher expenses, particularly healthcare costs, but also everyday costs. Healthcare costs are driving it, but housing costs, the cost of food, the cost of education. By the same token, you've got wages that were flat. That's a squeeze. So your take-home pay is not going up, but your expenses are going up. A lot of frustration around the country over the last several years about that. Now we see wages going up. 2.8% is the wage growth last month. That's the highest wage growth since the mid-2009s. So since mid-2009, which is, remember, before the recession, we've not seen wage growth like this. That's great news. I hope that we continue to see that solid wage growth, because that ultimately is what we ought to be looking for. Since the first of last year, I've held over a dozen small business roundtables around Ohio, where you bring small businesses in to talk to them about the tax reform bill, regulations, other issues they care about. Every single one of the small businesses that comes to these roundtables has a story to tell about how the tax reform helped them. These companies are pass-throughs, meaning they pay taxes individually, which is the case of the vast majority of small businesses. And so they're seeing the lower rates, but they're also seeing an advantage to the new laws on investment. If you invest money into your company, you can deduct it from your taxes now. You have bonus depreciation before, now you have 100% depreciation. You can write things off immediately. That makes a huge difference. And it's exciting. The presiding officer was talking about being at one of his small businesses in Louisiana today at lunch, and it's the same story I've heard all over our state. This was a distillery, as I recall, and in Ohio, our breweries and our distilleries are taking advantage of a specific part of the new tax bill that helps them on their excise taxes, but also just the overall lowering of the rate, investing in their business, investing in technology, increasing the productivity of their workers as a result, which all economists say is the key thing to getting wages up. We're beginning to see that, and it's exciting. Since the first year, I've also visited 22 businesses directly. So not a roundtable discussion as I'd have with these small businesses, but I go to these businesses and I talk to them specifically about how they're using this tax bill. And again, everyone's got good stories to tell. Some have added more jobs, some have increased wages and gone public about that. You know, Fifth Third Bank would be an example, or the Kroger Company in my hometown of Cincinnati, big businesses. A lot of smaller businesses have done that as well, but they've done other things too. Some have delivered bonuses, some have expanded retirement benefits, some have bought new equipment. A lot of the small businesses I know, I go talk to them, I say, what are you doing with this? I say, we're actually taking these older pieces of equipment we have, these machines, and we're upgrading them, which again, makes those workers more productive, makes that company more successful, allows wages to go up. In one small business that I visited, they had a machine that was roughly 31 years old. They got the machine in 1986. And I thought it was an amazing coincidence that this tax code, which hadn't been updated since 1986, was updated, and they were using the tax savings they got from that to take a machine that was bought that same year and upgrading it, modernizing it, about $1 million investment for them that they never could have made in a small business without the tax reform and tax cut legislation. So it is working. Sometimes, again, companies are doing a combination of these various things. They might be increasing the 401k match, but also adding more to their entry-level pay. So it's doing what was intended. In the first quarter, we have numbers already for the amount of money that came back to our country. So over $300 billion came back to the United States from overseas. That's what they call repatriation. Money that was earned overseas that companies were keeping overseas before because they had no incentive to bring it back. Now they have an incentive to bring it back. What does that mean? It means it gets invested here. Sometimes in that new equipment and new plant, sometimes in people's wallets and pocketbooks back here. That money is being used to help create this better economy we're talking about. By the way, that $300 billion, when compared to last year in the first quarter, about 10 times more. So this is because of the tax bill. The lower tax rates for individuals means that 90% of the people in America got a statement from their employer saying, guess what? Uncle Sam's going to take less out of your paycheck because their withholding changed. So for 90% of workers in America, they've gotten something saying, you're going to have more of your hard-earned money staying in your pocket. You're going to be able to take it home rather than having Uncle Sam take it out as part of your taxes. As I said during the tax reform debate, when we had very spirited debates here, some on the other side saying there's no middle-class tax relief in this legislation, I said the proof's in the paycheck. Lower rates, doubling the standard deduction, doubling the child tax credit, those are tax cuts. They're real. And sure enough, 90% of Americans saw that in their paychecks. The proof's in the paycheck. It's not really a political debate. It's a real-life situation for people who are living paycheck to paycheck, which is most of the people I represent. So it's a big deal. For the median income family in Ohio, that's $2,000 a year on average. That $2,000 a year means the vacation that they otherwise couldn't take. It means investing more in their health care, investing more in their retirement, investing more in their kids. So it's working. I noted earlier wages are rising at the fastest year-over-year rate since mid-2009, and that wage growth is accelerating. Along with these lower tax rates, along with the changes we talked about in terms of doubling the standard deduction, doubling the child tax credit, people are feeling more hope and opportunity. In due due in part to this lower business rate and more competitive international tax system, companies are looking to hire more. I mentioned that what I hear back in Ohio mostly now is we're looking for more workers. We're willing to hire people. We need the skills. There was a Gallup poll taken in May, and a record number of Americans said, quote, now is the time to find a quality job. A record number of Americans, because they see the help wanted signs. In fact, the number of Americans who are employed part-time for economic reasons, who want to work full-time but can only find part-time work, is now the lowest it's been since December of 2007. So you got to go back more than 10 years to find a number of people who are employed part-time, who want full-time work. That's the lowest it's been since December of 2007. That's good. We want people to work full-time, not part-time. I believe we're going to continue to see this rising tide in our economy, and I think there's some newer provisions in the tax code that are yet to be implemented that will help even more. There's a provision in the tax bill called opportunity zones, where if you invest in some of the neighborhoods in Ohio that have had the highest persistent, stubborn rates of poverty, then you get a tax break. That's going to really help to increase investment in some of those poor neighborhoods. Those opportunity zones are just getting started now, and that's going to help to ensure that people who have fallen behind have a chance to catch up. So John F. Kennedy once said famously, a rising tide lifts all boats. It can, but you got to be sure that you are going into those kind of neighborhoods and ensuring that they have the opportunity to be lifted too. And I think opportunity zones will help there. Despite this strong and growing economy, there does remain this weakness in our workforce that will continue to hold us back. And that is that a lot of Americans are not looking for work. They are literally on the sidelines. The labor economists call that a low labor force participation rate. It means that the percentage of people who are in the workforce looking for a job is relatively low. So you have this strong economy. You have the lowest unemployment numbers that we've had in years, going back to 1969. And yet, you have a lot of people in the shadows who are on the sidelines, who aren't even looking for work, so they don't show up in the unemployment numbers. If you took the labor force participation rate, again, the percent of people in the workforce, and you just go back, let's say 10 years ago, to just before the Great Recession, and you compare it to today, use the same labor force participation rate, what would you guess the unemployment number would be today? It's not 3.7%. It's more like 8.5%. So as strong as this economy is, as good as things are, as optimistic as people are, the fact that wages are going up, all good things. And the tax bill is hugely responsible for that. And it's helpful. It has pulled a lot of people back into work who are part-time work or underemployed. It has pulled people back into work altogether, but still there's this big group of Americans at historically high numbers, probably over 8 million men, as an example, between the ages of 25 and 55, able-bodied men who aren't working. That's wrong. It's wrong for them because they're not getting the dignity and self-respect that comes from work and helping them to be productive members of society. The numbers for women are perhaps not quite as high, but also at relatively high levels. But it's also bad for our economy. We need these workers. We want these people in the workforce, right? Why is it happening? Well, I think there are a few reasons. I think one reason is that Americans don't have the skills that we would hope they would have in order to meet the job requirements of today. What do I mean by that? Today, if you don't have a technical skill, whether you're in healthcare or whether you're in manufacturing or whether you're in one of the service industries, it's hard to find a job. So to our young people here today, get that skills training. And if you look at the unemployment in Ohio right now, OhioMeansJobs.com is a website. You can go on it and see that there are a lot of jobs being offered online right now, and yet there are a lot of people unemployed. Why is that? Well, you see that a lot of these jobs being offered for things like a machinist or a welder or someone with IT skills, information technology skills, coding as an example. If you go to coding skills, you can get a job in Ohio. In healthcare, there are a lot of people who are being hired who have those technical skills, including coding skills, to provide for digitized healthcare records as an example. If you look at the jobs that are being offered, You look at this high unemployment, you say it doesn't make sense, but part of it is because the job skills aren't there. So there's a lot of exciting stuff going on in my state and in other states where you have colleges, particularly some of our community colleges, who are working closely with some of our businesses and also with some of our high schools. The high schools have career and technical education now that is expanding. In Ohio, we're doing a good job, I think, of getting more and more young people interested in career and technical education. We started a caucus here, Senator Kane and myself, who's on the other side of the aisle, to promote CTE. We passed legislation recently to expand the federal incentives for career and technical education and improve the standards. That's good. We're making progress, but we're not there yet. There's still a lot of skills training that should and can go on in order to provide people with the tools they need to be able to be successful in today's economy. So that's part of it. Part of it, I think, is the dependency trap. What do I mean by that? There's an issue. When you're on government support, when you're on government dependency, and you want to go to work. And it's both the fact that there's a cliff in terms of losing your benefits, and also there's a mountain in terms of higher taxes. So one thing that some of us have worked on here, and we need to do more on, is to say, how do you work with the states to provide for that transition? If someone wants to go to work, leave a government program, how do you have some way to transition that so that you don't have this big cliff and this mountain ahead of you? Because that creates a disincentive. I do think there's work that can be done there. But I will tell you, I think the biggest single issue in terms of these relatively high numbers of people who are out of work altogether, the people who are on the sidelines, is actually the opioid crisis and the drug issue. Why do I say that? Well, one, I see it back home. I go around my state. I spend a lot of time talking to people at treatment centers. I talk to people who are in recovery. I talk to people who are addicted. I talk to people who are experts providing that treatment or that longer-term recovery, and talk to first responders. And there are just a lot of people in my state. Now, we're probably top 5 in the country in terms of the percentage of people addicted, the number of overdoses per capita, the number of deaths per capita. You know, in America as a whole, we lost 72,000 people last year to drug overdoses. Historically high numbers. These are record numbers, grim statistics. More people died last year of drug overdoses than we lost in the entire Vietnam conflict. Think about that. But a lot of these people are addicted. They aren't part of the statistics you read about the overdose and deaths, as tragic as those are, but they're another part of the statistic, which is people who are not productive in life because they're not engaged anymore with their friends or their family or their work. The drugs have become everything. I'll give you a couple of statistics that I think are shocking to me. One is from the U.S. Department of Labor. They did a study of men between, again, 25 and 55 who are out of the workforce to say, how could this be? Over 8 million men out of the workforce altogether, particularly with this relatively low unemployment, these opportunities out there, these jobs that are being offered. They found that almost half of those men acknowledged taking pain medication on a daily basis. On a daily basis. What does that mean? Well, there's another study by the Brookings Institute. Brookings says, again, about half the people who they surveyed, almost half, said that they were taking pain medication on a regular basis. One said the day before, one said on a daily basis. And what they also said was, asked a further question, how many of you are taking prescription drugs? 2/3 of the people acknowledged are taking prescription drugs, pain medication. These are shocking statistics. And by the way, I do not believe this is overreported. I believe it is underreported. Because who's going to say that they're addicted to pain medication? I mean, that's one. There's reasons in the legal system not to do that. But there's also other reasons not to do it. A lot of people still feel like it's something they can't talk about. We've changed that to a certain extent. The stigma has been removed to a certain extent. And here in this body, I think we've helped by talking about drug addiction as a disease, which I believe it is. And you need to treat a disease as you would other diseases. It's not a moral failing. It's a disease that has to be medically treated. But still, there are people who are not coming forward, feel that stigma, no question about it. Probably 8 out of the 10 people in my state who are addicted are not getting any kind of treatment. So I think this is another issue that we've got to face for all the right reasons, to help these people get their life back on track, to help these people be able to achieve what God's purpose is for them, what certainly is not to be an addict, and not to be actively using, and not to be causing all the pain and disruption it causes all through our society. Number one cause of crime in my state of Ohio, and pretty much every county I represent, is this issue. It's not necessarily the drug use, it's the crime that goes along with it, the property crimes and theft and fraud and so on to pay for the drug habit. If you go to your emergency room in Ohio, you will find that it's the number one issue they talk about. Our neonatal units, sad but true, more and more babies being born with what's called neonatal abstinence syndrome, which means their moms were addicted. These kids have to be taken through withdrawal as babies, provided morphine and other drugs just to get them through withdrawal. It is incredibly sad. We don't know what the long-term impact is on these kids, but it is a huge problem. It's the number one problem I see back home in our hospitals and who are taking care of babies. If you go to our prisons, our jails, go to our courtrooms, what's the number one issue? Drugs. Primarily opioids. Of the 72,000 people who died of overdoses last year, by the way, the biggest single killer was not just opioids, but it was fentanyl, this new synthetic opioid that's come in mostly from China, mostly through the Postal Service. It's outrageous that continues to happen. And we're taking steps to address it. But my point is, all of us are affected by this. All of us. You may not think you are, although more and more people see it directly because their friends or family or themselves are caught up in this, but all of us are affected, including our economy. And so as good as these economic numbers are, I'm so glad that we passed that tax reform legislation because I really think it has helped spur this economic growth and this opportunity for so many people. It's increasing wages, it's doing so many good things. But the next step, as I see it, is to say, okay, how do we take these people who are not in a position to get on that first rung of the economic ladder, much less the second and third, and climb up because of their addiction? How do we get them back on track? Get them to face up to their addiction, get into treatment, get them into that longer-term recovery, which we know works better to get them off of their addiction and get them back into a productive life where they can reconnect, not just with work, but with their families, with their friends, with their community, with their faith. The drugs become everything, as I've heard from so many addicts and recovering addicts. The American Action Forum released a report earlier this month that found that Ohio lost about 86,000 workers and about $72 billion in economic growth from 1999 to 2015 due to the opioid addiction. So this affects all of us, and it certainly affects our economy, and that's the next step that we must take. Back in 2016, Congress started to get much more engaged in this issue. We passed two great bills, one called the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and I were the co-authors. This is broad, comprehensive legislation. Today, we were able to announce a number of grants to Ohio that are working to expand treatment to ensure that some of these gaps are filled where people get addicted, overdose, Narcan is applied, the miracle drug that reverses the effects of that overdose, and yet they go right back into the community. We don't want that. We want to get them into treatment, so these grants will help. We also passed legislation called the Cures Act, 21st Century Cures Act, that provides funding directly back to the states. So CARA goes to these nonprofits and others, programs that are working, evidence-based programs to help on treatment and recovery and prevention. Cures goes to the states directly and allow the states to spread that funding out where it will help. Every state's a little different, has different kinds of needs. So we're starting to see some progress on the ground. But again, the fentanyl has come in and kind of overwhelmed a lot of the progress that I've seen. On the fentanyl side, we passed legislation just last week that finally says to our United States Post Office, you must screen these packages coming in from overseas because we know this poison, the number one killer, 4,000% increase in fentanyl overdose deaths in my state of Ohio in the last 5 years. It's the number one killer now. We know it's coming from the post office. It's coming to your P.O. box. It's coming to an abandoned warehouse from our post office. We finally said to them, you got to close this loophole, because there's a loophole. They don't have to provide law enforcement the data on these packages to be able to find that needle in the haystack which is too hard to find without that data. Private carriers have to provide that data to law enforcement. The post office does not. That's all going to change when the president signs this legislation next week. So we're going to start to push back to keep some of this poison out of our communities. But we need to do much more. The legislation we passed this week also provides more funding for treatment. It gets rid of an outdated rule that says you can only have 16 beds in a treatment center if you get Medicaid reimbursement. That's a vestige of years past, during the deinstitutionalization of folks who had mental health issues, behavioral health issues. But it doesn't work today because we want these good treatment centers that are doing a good job to be able to expand the number of beds they have for residential treatment, because that's what works for some people. And unbelievably, today they have to turn people away, even though they're there, they're ready, they can take these people, but they have this 16-bed limit. There are too many cases. And I know of people in Ohio who have told me that when they were ready, or in one case, a father told me when his daughter was ready finally to go to a treatment center, he walked her down there, they went to the treatment center, she was ready to enter, she had come to that point in her life where she realized that she needed to do this, and they told her there was no room. No room at the inn, because 16-bed limit. In the next 2 weeks, while she was waiting to get into that treatment center, you know what happened. She used again, she was addicted, she overdosed, and she died in her parents' home. That father is really happy about this legislation. It also includes language to help with regard to these moms and kids we talked about earlier, and that's important as well. It helps to ensure there's a safe plan for these mothers who are addicted, to allow them to taper off from their use of drugs so their babies are born in a healthy state and don't have to go through what I talked about earlier, which is incredibly sad to see, tragic. Where literally these babies born with this neonatal abstinence syndrome, as it's called, have to be taken through a withdrawal. And it also includes the CRIB Act, legislation that, again, is bipartisan, as were all these bills I'm talking about. Senator Dick Durbin and I have worked on the IMD exclusion, the issue with the 16 beds, for years, many years. We finally got it done. The CRIB Act is one that provides support for these babies we talked about, because often the babies can't go back to their folks. Their parents are addicted. Where are they going to go? There are nonprofits that have sprung up that provide help for these babies, transition to get them into the right foster care, perhaps to get them with a grandparent or a great-grandparent, which is happening more and more in my state because the parents are not able to take care of these kids. Parents need to focus, one would hope, on their own treatment and recovery. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but the point is the baby can't be with them. And these organizations are in a position to help, because these organizations like Bridget's Path in Dayton, Ohio, that I visited, unbelievable. They have volunteers come in just to hold the babies, just to show the babies love that they need so desperately. They couldn't get reimbursement under the federal government. Now they can under the CRIB Act that we just passed. So this will help the babies, the moms, treatment, keeping the poison out. It is helpful. And as we've discussed this afternoon, in combination with a stronger economy that comes from the kind of fiscal and economic policies we've pursued here, and especially the tax reform, also regulatory relief, that combination can lead to great things, because it can provide that opportunity if, again, people are ready to get on that next rung of the ladder, to be able to find that opportunity for themselves and their family because they've dealt with their addiction. A rising tide can't lift all boats, and this growing economy gives us an opportunity to bring people out of the shadows and into a productive life of work, family, faith. In the midst of the opioid epidemic, we've got to do more to catch those who fall through the cracks, those who are gripped by this addiction, be able to find more meaning and purpose in their lives, and we now have that opportunity. That's what's exciting about it. So, Mr. President, I'm pleased our new opioid legislation is going to be signed into law by the President next week. I'm pleased to see the progress with the economy based on the policies that we have passed here to provide people with a little more take-home pay, to give companies more incentive to invest, to level the playing field internationally so American workers weren't being disadvantaged. It's coming together. It's working. Let's combine that with an equal focus on dealing with the opioid crisis. We'll be able to see so many other people take advantage of their American dream. I yield back my time.